Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar, brought to you by Techstrong and Revenera. My name is Cody J. Brown. I'm the host of Techstrong Learning. We have an exciting presentation ahead of us, but first, I have a couple of housekeeping notes to cover. First off, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any of our discussion, or you'd like to rewatch, the on-demand recording will be made available shortly after we conclude our webinar today. If you have any questions for our speakers today, we want you to send those questions in using the Q&A tab on the right side of the screen. And for any additional comments, or you just want to let us know from where you're tuning in, that's where we want you to use the chat tab. If you will click the handouts tab, which can also be found on the right side of your screen, you'll find a couple different resources that will help aid in following along with today's webinar. And finally, at the conclusion of our webinar, we will be giving away 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So our topic today is open source, what we learned in 2021 and 2022 predictions. I'm joined today by Alex Rybak, Director of Product Management at Revenera, and Russ Eling, Founder and CEO of OSS Consultants. It's my pleasure to turn the floor over to Alex to get us started, but thank you both for being here with me today.
All right, thank you, Cody, and thanks, Russ, for joining me. So let's do a couple quick intros of us, and then we'll get into our topics. So I'm Alex Rybak, as Cody mentioned. I'm the Director of Product Management at Revenera. I am focused on our software composition analysis solutions, but I'm also part of our internal cybersecurity team, where we deal with both external reports of security incidents, as well as open source compliance and putting our SBOMs together and overall open source management program. So I'll be able to speak about some of these topics from those different perspectives and hopefully give you more of an insider view as to how we do things, as well as from Russ's perspective on how he does things. So Russ, over to you.
Thanks, Alex. Hi, everyone. My name is Russ, founder of OSS Consultants. We just announced our new or updated name last week, actually. So originally we were OSS Engineering Consultants, and now we've simplified that to just OSS Consultants. So our rebrand served two purposes, really. We're shortening our name provides a more inclusive experience to our customers that have software staff that might be outside of engineering departments. And then also we have our customer base comes from a variety of backgrounds as well. And we thought it was the right time to remove engineering from our name in order to make other departments and disciplines feel equally supported. Plus, OSS Consultants is much easier to spell and type in a browser. Just kidding. So we're a business dedicated to helping organizations of all sizes, from the world's largest and well-known companies to small businesses and startups, design, implement, and manage the most efficient and comprehensive open source program offices and policies on the planet. Before I started the company, I spent over 20 years in several engineering roles at General Motors. In my last role at GM, I developed and implemented a successful open source program office and built the team responsible for reviewing software for use of open source in every GM vehicle across the globe. Most recently, we helped BlackBerry attain the very first whole entity open chain conformance in North America. So we did that right across their entire product portfolio. And we can get into some of those details after when we get to open chain. All right, Alex, back to you.
All right, perfect. So we're here today in what is now becoming an annual webinar, which is great. A little bit later this year than usual, but the way we're going to do this is in two parts. We're going to start off by going back a year and reviewing what we proposed would be the kind of the top themes of 2021, and kind of see how we did, and offer some commentary there. And then we'll turn the page to 22 and talk about what we think are going to be the areas of focus around open source management, and give our kind of insights and perspectives on each of the topics. And I do want to again echo that we definitely welcome questions. So if you have any, please go ahead and post them into the Q&A section, and we will address them later on in the presentation. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go back to 2021. So in 2021, we had a very similar webinar, and we offered 10 predictions for where we thought people are going to be spending their time and what's going to happen. So I'll let Russ cover the first few, and then I will cover the remaining ones.
All right. So the first one, we predicted an increase in appetite for shifting left. And then, of course, what we saw after making those predictions was the cybersecurity executive order. There was additional high-profile supply chain attacks, and other recent large-scale vulnerabilities like Log4j. So events like these can sometimes be a forcing function for organizations, to realize the benefit of being able to be proactive by knowing your use of open source and being able to assess quickly versus reactive, where we have an event or an incident and it takes just way too long to identify the potential exposure. Software supply chain maturity. I think that ties into my point on the first prediction. So I think everyone in a software supply chain was forced to become more mature in 2021. I think a lot of eyes were opened with Log4j. I thought that with SolarWinds and Colonial Pipeline and other more recent public security incidents that perhaps that would have been the wake-up call around knowing what open source you're using. But if those didn't, if those weren't the wake-up call, then I think Log4j certainly was. Almost everyone was impacted in some way by that. For us specifically, we had a bit of a spike in people asking about ways to approach being more proactive. So I think companies are trying to be more prepared for whatever the next threat might be.
Yeah, and we'll definitely talk about Log4j more as part of the 22 points.
Open source and security training. So I believe this increased, at least based on the demand I saw. Alex, you can chime in there if you want as well. The training requests were most often targeted to the overlap of security and compliance in open source software, and why having an accurate inventory is so critical. Again, I think the software supply chain events of 21 drove some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. And as engineering teams are asked to, number one, assess the impact of Log4j, and number two, respond to it, there's certainly lots of training. If it wasn't done before that, that was definitely a point where training was required to allow teams to comply with their internal policies.
Esport continues to grow due to dependencies. So we saw this firsthand. We saw a significant increase in the software inventory counts last year. As one probably extreme example, my team worked on a product SBOM or inventory that had a combined 84,000 open source components. So that was the largest inventory for a single product that I had ever seen. And roughly half of that number was due to the use of either direct or transitive dependencies.
Yep, absolutely. And the other point I'll throw into this is, although the overall volume of open source continues to grow, from our experience on Revenera's side, the amount that people know about their code base is still fairly flat. So every time we do any sort of audits on behalf of our customers, we always ask for disclosures up front. We are seeing a bit of an uptick, and there are cases, there's outliers where people do a fairly decent job project to project. But if you take the entire year as an aggregate, the disclosure rate is still single digits, and people still have very little insight into what is inside their applications.
Emphasis on the importance of the SBOM. So if there's anything 2021 taught us about open source, it was the importance of the bill of materials, or the software bill of materials, the SBOM, or simply your inventory of open source. So without an inventory, you don't know what you have. So you can't fix, comply, or secure what you don't know is there. So shifting left, supply chain attacks, supply chain maturity, training, managing dependencies. This all boils down to knowing what open source you're using and where it's located in your product or in your organization.
Yep, absolutely. And we did also see a fairly big shift from having to educate people on what an SBOM means and what are the elements of an SBOM, to where we're seeing a lot of our customers kind of crossing that threshold and really coming to us with specific asks, as opposed to not being aware of what's happening. So definitely lots of learning has occurred the past year. Okay, so moving on, one item where we were way off, which was we thought that there would be consolidation in open source marketplaces. So basically, where do people go to source open source components? There's been the exact inverse. I did a kind of a quick look last night, and I found anywhere between 80 to 100 just well-listed repositories. So if you happen to be working in JavaScript or .NET or Java, where can you go to source your components? There's lots of places. We have not seen any consolidation. In fact, new repositories keep popping up, especially in JavaScript world. There's kind of a new one, flavor of the month every month. So we were completely off on this one, and there's actually been more options for developers to go grab from. So we do think at some point we'll get there where companies will start selecting where they trust and where they don't trust and sourcing from a less number of locations, but definitely not something that we saw last year. M&A. So we definitely saw the pace of M&A increase. Now this one is a little odd just due to COVID. M&A really slowed down for a period of time. So it's hard to know whether, had there not been the COVID event, whether overall 21 compared to 20 would have increased, but we definitely saw a big increase. Statistically, we saw close to 80% of our audit projects on behalf of our customers were M&A, which was up 14% over the prior year. Now, again, this could be somewhat artificially inflated by the fact that there was a slowdown, but definitely M&A market is back. It's strong. We're seeing a lot of demand for it, and lots of companies are taking opportunity to purchase at better valuations than there were in the past. So definitely something to watch out for. Along with that, we still see kind of an appetite for moving faster. So we did assume that timelines will continue to get compressed, and they have. We've noticed our customers' appetite for our audit projects getting compressed, and people expecting not only quicker turnaround, but more frequent updates. So before, where we could say we'll have a preliminary report out to you in a week or in 2 weeks, people expect next day information. They expect kind of give me the top 3-5 concerning results so that we can start working on it. So there's definitely a desire for smaller digestible pieces, as well as just the overall timelines being much shorter. I don't know, Russ, if you're seeing the same thing on your end, but we're definitely seeing it on our end.
Yep, pretty much the same thing. Less time to produce more results.
Yep. Now, the next two that we predicted were around kind of market challenges. So the first one was about data, right? And the fact that the volume of data will continue to increase, that there will be a challenge both with maintaining data currency, meaning how up to date you are on the data that you have, as well as just dealing with false positives, both on compliance and security front. And that definitely happened, right? We have more vulnerabilities than ever. Keeping up with which ones are the most important, which ones are the most relevant, which ones are exploitable in your particular context for your products. That's an ongoing challenge. It did not get any better last year, as well as just the volume of open source. We continue to have more and more repositories, more components, more GitHub repositories. So that is a trend that we expect to continue on going forward. And then the last one we had was kind of a challenge with scaling and deployment models. And this one, happened to some extent. We definitely see an inflection point between people trying to scale more, trying to use SCA more across the enterprise, trying to scale their deployments, trying to get more teams involved, trying to get their partners involved. So we're now crossing boundaries between companies. Ours is an on-prem solution. So being able to work with vendors that have scanning behind their firewall and consumers of that information behind their own firewall, communicating across is certainly a challenge. So we are definitely seeing some of this happening last year, and definitely more needs around product roadmap to be able to have better transparency and better communication across the supply chain and across multiple vendors. Okay, so that was a look back on 21. So, about 90% accurate, so it's good. And we will now shift over to 2022. So here, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about 5 topics, and we'll talk about kind of our perspectives on the different elements of these, and then we'll summarize at the end on what we think our predictions are going to be for the rest of this year and heading into 23. Okay, so the first topic is about getting your house in order. And this one is critically important, and it will certainly mean different things for different organizations. But kind of as an overarching theme, there are lots of external forces at play. There are various Esport mandates, so we'll get into kind of discussion of that. There are continuing security pressures. There was the very disruptive Log4j event in December of last year, which companies are still recovering from. And that really left a lot of ripples as far as how risk-averse your security team is, whether there's more focus on perceived risk versus actual risk. So we'll talk about that. And in general, kind of what are some of the themes of what we expect companies to do to be able to handle the next scenario better than perhaps they're able to handle Log4j. So let's talk about Esport mandates. So if you look at the quote there, so according to Linux Foundation SBOM Cybersecurity Readiness Report of last year, there's an estimate that there's going to be 66% growth in both production and consumption of SBOMs, which will lead to close to 80% of organizations having something to do with an SBOM. Either they are going to be required to produce one, or they will be asking their suppliers to produce one for them and in some way consume them and make it actionable, right? So those are pretty big numbers. And hopefully this is true, right? Hopefully we do get to those numbers, but that would be a significant increase over what has been happening the past few years. Now, there's lots of kind of mandates out there, right, ranging from the executive order on cybersecurity from the Biden administration. There's lots of various mandates in EMEA and various organizations there. And then you kind of get into the various industry segments, right? So telco, automotive, payments, medical devices. So anything that can essentially harm you either physically or financially or data privacy-wise has some sort of mandates or best practices around security. And if you have any hopes of achieving better control over security, you need to have transparency into what is in the software that you either consume and or supply to downstream in your software supply chain. So we get kind of to the SBOM mandates. So SBOM is a software bill of material. It is a description of, think of it as an ingredients list of what elements are in your software applications. And it covers both your proprietary code, your commercial code, third party, and open source software. So it's a comprehensive ingredients list, essentially, of everything that is inside your product. Okay, so that's kind of what it is. I'll let Russ weigh in on this point as well.
Yeah, so I mean, you talked about the minimum elements, and if you look at the minimum elements for an SBOM that was published by the Department of Commerce of the NTIA, you'll see that component name, version, dependency, and relationships are the central elements. So these minimum elements are very similar to what you might already be tracking for your use of open source software. Other types of software you might find on the SBOM, as Alex mentioned, would be like non-open source third-party software, commercial software, and whatever else is not open source in there. So kind of Alex already mentioned, the scope of SBOM is broader than just open source bill of materials. To put it another way, the OS SBOM can be thought of as a subset of what you might find on an SBOM.
Yep, and if you look at kind of the SBOM use cases, right, there's really two main ones, right? So one is, how do you knowledge share? How do you become transparent with your supply chain partners, right? How do you understand what you're taking into your business? How do your customers or your partners downstream understand what are they getting from you, right? Can they trust your process? Can they trust what is inside your application? And how do they then provide that trust downstream to their customers? The other use case is kind of more reactive. So the next log4j hits, and there will be something else that's significant. Well, if you have kind of a cataloging of all the assets that are in your software, both deployed and that you sell to your customers, it makes it much easier to assess the risk that you may incur from a particular exploit. So as opposed to having to go team by team and try to vet whether they're using log4j, you can query your bill of material, understand, number one, where you're using it, but more importantly, understand where it came from, so kind of the provenance of that component. And that's why dependencies and provenance are really important, because you need to understand, how do you fix it? Right? Is this something you're going to deploy your own engineering teams to fix, or is it something you're going to rely on one of your suppliers, or are you going to wait for an open source community to patch and fix the vulnerability and then make sure that you have the proper version of that component in future builds of your products? So having those elements inside your SBOM of kind of what it is and where it came from is critically important. Okay, so I guess let's talk about security, right? So this is probably a study that happened earlier in the year before the log4j, obviously, but there's an estimation that 64% of organizations were impacted by a supply chain attack. With log4j, I would say the number is going to be much higher, right? Everybody who built a product using Java was in some way impacted by log4j. And there's a couple things that are important to understand here. Number one, your engineering teams are likely overwhelmed with this. Everyone post log4j has likely had a mandate by their security team to put more emphasis in on getting ahead of this, right? And not be so much on their heels next time there's a vulnerability attack or a vulnerability published, trying to figure out where you may be exposed. Right. So if they did that, that means that your teams are getting lots of pressure to burn down the technical debt of security issues, to do more upfront security work in the products, to be able to harden applications, to be able to provide more visibility into what are potentially security exploits in their applications. So if you're going to do that, you need to really understand, well, what's the downstream impact? Right? Chances are your team's velocity is going to go down because they're not just working on new features. They have to pay attention more to security. And one of the main reasons we're seeing for this is that lots of security teams have become much more risk averse after the Log4j exploit. So even if you have a dormant Log4j jar in your product that may not be exploitable, just the mere fact that it's there gives a perception that you have a security problem. And that's kind of a new thing, right? In the past, just having vulnerable components around may not have been enough of a reason for someone to force you to upgrade it. These days, that's becoming more of a concern, and something where perception matters just as much as actual reality of what's exploitable out there. Okay. Russ, anything you want to add about the security side of it?
Nope. I can jump in on the next point there if you
want. Sure, please, go for it.
All right. So regarding continuous process, we mentioned at the beginning about helping with the first whole entity open chain conformance in North America. One of the major benefits when we talk about continuous process is that open chain requires you to have a documented process around the elements that make up a good open source program, and the benefits of those elements. They can extend beyond just the license compliance aspect. So many of the elements can, in the open chain standard, enable you to better be prepared for any potential future regulation or new security vulnerabilities that might surface. If you look at one particular example in the open chain ISO standard, one of the certification questions is, do you have a documented procedure for identifying, tracking, and archiving information about the open source components in a supplied software release? So once you have a process defined for that and you follow it, then you've met that requirement in the open chain spec, but then you also automatically get a leg up on being able to produce an SBOM. And then now you have much more visibility into finding that potential vulnerability in your use of open source. So while the requirement itself is brief, clearly, but like fulfilling it, that's what takes the work. On the flip side, you could see the multitude of benefits, and then managing use of open source becomes so much easier once you know what's in it.
Yeah, and I definitely say, you don't want to waste a good crisis here. So even if your organization is not pushing for this, the whole Log4j event is a great conversation starter to push your organization to do better and to invest more in continuous processes. So that was definitely a wake-up call to get away from, we're going to do our compliance work towards the end of a release cycle and make sure that that's done throughout the entire development process. And we'll talk about that more in subsequent point. Okay, so let's move on to the second area, and let's talk about the shift to cloud. So this is a fairly obvious one, but definitely warrants some discussion. So if you look at this, right, so the move to cloud was definitely been underway for several years. The whole COVID situation certainly accelerated it, right? The way that we live, the way that we work has changed. There's a lot more distributed teams. There's a lot more remote teams. So cloud applications have definitely accelerated in both development kind of new applications, as well as lift and shift and moving typical on-prem products to the cloud. So as you look at kind of what happens when that process is underway, typically there's a much higher adoption of open source components to build cloud applications. So number one, there's lots of kind of mature elements already in place, so you don't want to reinvent the wheel. But typically you end up with much more modern code bases, more modern components being used, and those tend to be smaller bits with lots of dependencies and smaller sizes. So you end up with a much larger bill of material than traditionally, where you may have written a lot more of your own code. So if you look at the kind of the Forrester study that happened, there's kind of this expectation that about half of all enterprise organizations are going to be working on cloud adoption projects, and that's, that sounds pretty reasonable. So if you look at kind of, well, what's pushing it, right? So number one, as I mentioned, certainly the dynamic of how we live and work has changed. Number two, there's lots of kind of keeping up with the Joneses, right? If you're in an industry where your competitors are moving to the cloud, you're likely going to be motivated or pushed to do that as well. As you kind of start doing this, or as you continue doing this, and you start adopting more open source as part of your application development, well, you need to make sure you have the safeguards in place, because the more you consume it, the harder it's going to be to not manage it through some sort of program. So that's where things like OpenChain is a great process that's outlined there, and just having more continuous programs on your end to be able to keep up with the volume of third-party content that you're going to ingest. So time certainly is of the essence. Anytime you talk about cloud, right, there's much faster release cycles. There's much quicker expectations in the field for features to be brought to market. So this is where you have risks of cutting corners on governance to be able to release quickly, to build quickly, to deploy quickly. And you want to make sure that you have a process that is heavily relying on automation, to where you don't have a human having to sit in the middle and remember to do a certain manual task, because everything just moves way too fast. And I guess the last thing I'd kind of say here is that remediation is always going to be more expensive than doing it right the first time. So you're definitely financially motivated to get it right, as opposed to having to come back and rip out large pieces of your product because you didn't consider the consequences of the things that you're bringing into the house.
Yeah, and I'll just add in relative to the inventory and housekeeping side. So we've noticed organizations that end up being surprised to find some really old code that's still lingering in a code base, but likely not being used in a product. So beyond identifying unused code, this could be an opportunity to do some housekeeping and make things operate more efficiently by removing it. So if you don't, 5 years down the road, someone will ask about it and no one will want to remove it out of fear that something will break.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that just kind of came to mind, which I do want to bring up, is if you think of kind of analysis of cloud applications versus on-prem, there's definitely a lot more interest on a broader analysis of scope, right? So platform, environment, third-party containers, right? We're not just talking about understanding what is in your specific product that's in the cloud, but everything that's next to it, right? There's definitely more interest in the environment that is deployed in, the safeguards around the entire SDLC process, and what kind of security do you have in your development process. So the dynamic shifts a bit because you don't have the protection of having a behind the firewall on-prem application. It's much more open, much more exposed. So certainly there's a lot more security concerns around the kind of the bigger environment that you're deployed in, as opposed to just focus on your individual application. So another thing to keep in mind as part of the shift to cloud initiative. Okay, moving on. So let's talk about, well, what are some of the safeguards that people are likely going to be putting in place this year to be able to protect against these risks? So kind of we always go back to, well, think of who's going to be doing the work, right? A lot of this work will likely fall on development teams. In some cases, you may decide to stand up teams of specialists that know what to do around open source management. So it's really important to, number one, have proper expectations. Number two, make sure that you put people in there with good likelihood of succeeding, which means you need to invest in adequate training. You need to think through roles, responsibilities, skill sets, what capabilities you have in-house, where they have somebody responsible for the process, right? You don't want to put a process out and ultimately there's nobody accountable for it. So making sure that you invest in your teams that are being asked to take on the work of safeguarding your organization against this risk becomes critically important. And then the other thing you want to make sure that you do is that people know what's expected of them, right? So expectations are really important, because lots of people who will be engaged in this process didn't necessarily learn about this as part of their education, right? This is something that is a new role, a new function that you may be putting on top of people's full-time jobs. And you want to make sure that you set them up for the most likelihood of success. So you want to definitely set the right expectations, make sure they're adequately trained and that they understand what is being asked of them.
Yeah, I'll just chime in here a little bit on training. So clearly, it's important for the developers to have training on compliance and security. But one of the approaches we take, I don't expect the developers to become experts in either of those. So they should all understand, what it is and why it's important, so they know what to do and who to ask when they encounter something that they've been trained on. Another point on training. So in addition to developers, it's also good for technical leaders as well as non-technical resources to receive training on open source, or at least the risks and why it matters, so that it can be applied to a broader context across the business as opposed to just in the software development aspect.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because you need to look at the other stakeholders that are involved with your product process, right? So marketing, sales, right? They need to understand that this is critically important. You may not be able to release as many features because you're going to have to dedicate some time to either working on security issues or supporting teams that are doing it for you and coming back to you with remediation work that needs to get worked into the backlog and prioritized along with kind of things that the field needs. So it's important for sales to understand why, for example, you may be taking longer to develop a particular feature because there's other work that needs to now be accounted for as part of the backlog process. Okay, so inventory management.
Inventory management. Yep. So, I think better dependency management and inventory management in general go hand in hand. So inventory is critical regardless of your focus, whether it's open source compliance or the security of open source. As I said earlier, you can't comply, secure, or remediate any software you don't know is there. And at the beginning of the session, I mentioned that I spent the first part of my career in the automotive industry. So I like to make this association of open source inventory and the inventory and tracking practices in automotive manufacturing. So every car built has a listing of every part required to build that car. So this helps the automaker to quickly track and then address any quality issues. So if and when a part happens to be faulty, you could quickly determine which cars were affected and then prioritize any subsequent actions that might be needed, such as recalls or service bulletins. So the same should be true for software. Similar to automotive parts, with an inventory, an organization can track every open source component they use, and then they have that better ability to resolve those issues when they arise. In the case of security, knowing the exact version of each component is critical. So that includes the dependencies you might be pulling in. We talked about this on previous slides. The accuracy of your open source inventory allows you to assess the risks quickly and then potentially reduce or eliminate any unnecessary rework or remediations. As Alex mentioned earlier, it costs a lot more to remediate than it does to do it right the first time.
Yeah, and I think the other consideration around inventory management is, where do you source it from? Right? I think this is something that doesn't get enough attention today, which is the idea that in theory, every developer is kind of free to go source from anywhere they can find, right? And we do think over time there will be more controls over this, right? There will be vetted ecosystems, so you may trust Maven and Apache Foundation over an individual developer in another country, right? So this idea of a kind of a trusted area of sourcing components, I think will go a long way to at least understanding where things come from, where do you go to get them fixed, and just the overall level of trust you have in the third-party content that's coming into your application. And the fourth point here is continuous discovery, which really should be kind of continuous process. So discovery, remediation, refinement, improvements, and so forth. So this one's important, right? Hopefully, coming out of the Log4j experience, each of your organizations did a retrospective on what worked, what didn't work. We did several at our company. We did it for each division. We also did it as an organization, because many larger organizations are going to have various business units. They may all operate somewhat independently, but be loosely coupled. And there's a couple of things we learned by doing a retrospective. Number one, we learned one of the challenges was communication. Right? If you have different divisions, different business units, how are you consistent in the way that you communicate both internally and to your customers and partners? How do you make the process more of a push from product teams to your communication folks versus them having to run around the company and kind of pull information from each team? It's very hard to do, and it's very exhausting. It's a lot of work to try to get data from what could be tens or hundreds of different teams and try to collate it all and try to present kind of a cohesive set of communication to your customers. So making the teams more accountable and more kind of operate independently and be able to provide consistent level of information So those can be passed on to customers. Really important. Certainly there will be the next event where entire company is going to need to assess risk and impact. So being able to do a retrospective, get learnings, figure out where you can do better next time, really important. The other point I will make here as part of continuous discovery is don't forget past cycles, right? So log4j at some point will become a memory and will be replaced by the next kind of shiny object, right? That doesn't mean it's not going to come back, right? Don't have a false sense of security because you are in log4j 1.x and that's not directly impacted by the log4shell vulnerability. Don't forget about struts. Don't forget about OpenSSL. We're still seeing things that were very relevant back in 2014, still coming up in scans in 2022. I would kind of suggest you come up with your list of toxic components and keep adding to it. Don't forget that things in the past are going to come back up in the future. And every time you have to do this assessment for a new vulnerability, it's a great opportunity to go back and just double check everything you looked at in the past to make sure it hasn't come back to bite you later on in the future. Okay, so let's move on to the next one and talk about how we think this will impact your business, right? So we kind of talked about 3 different topics around safeguards and cloud and getting your house in order. So, well, what does that all mean? So according to the Compliance Week survey, there's about 66% of respondents that said that there's a disconnect between risk and compliance that slows down their ability to respond. Right. So we really want to talk about what we think is going to happen and what we think is going to be the downstream impact to your organizations. So the first thing, and this is pretty obvious, is we definitely expect to see an increase in regulatory announcements. As the Biden cybersecurity executive order kind of crystallizes into specific requirements, it can be coming up on a year in May. We definitely expect the velocity of updates to increase. We certainly expect that to have rippling effects into private sectors. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And we definitely expect that customers and companies are going to have to continue to monitor changes, especially if they sell into the US government, into defense, into regulated industries, and understand how the rules that they have to abide by are going to change over time. Understand what's expected of them, if there's any new certifications that are required, if the definition of what is an SBOM or the minimum standards for an SBOM expand over time, to make sure they're keeping up with the current requirements and make sure that they're ahead on their ability to comply with them. Okay, so that's number one. And this is again, another place where OpenChain is very useful. So I'll let Russ talk about that a little bit more.
Yeah, we touched on OpenChain on a couple slides already. So I'll just say that OpenChain is the standard for the framework of what elements your open source program should have. So this is more focused around process and policy. So whatever standards happen to come along in the future, they'll likely be around the actual use of open source. So perhaps ones that might define the characteristics of the software itself. OpenChain is a great place to start, though. So if you're not sure how or where to start, there's companies that can help. Feel free to reach out afterwards or during Q&A or by email if you've got any questions on how to get started, and I'd be happy to walk you through some of the steps.
Okay. So second part of impact is we fully expect that industries and different sectors that have been silent to open source will have to start taking a position, right? So if you're working on and under any sort of quality standards, any sort of regulations that don't have specific language about software components and software contents, we fully expect that they will be forced to take a position. Right now, it may not be as strong as others, but the content of your software applications will have to be a factor in any sort of quality or governance programs. Okay. And I think Russ, you had a few.
Yeah, I'll just jump in with something related to that. So almost every vendor agreement that I've seen includes some provision for declaring or indemnifying against any use of open source. So sometimes it's unreasonable, like you can't use open source, to very vague, like the vendor shall inform company of any use of open source without defining how or when. So the expectation of open source language in vendor agreements is very widespread, but the degree of those expectations or requirements, those will likely change to become more comprehensive, especially in light of SBOM, OpenChain, and other potential regulation. And just to clarify, when I say comprehensive, that doesn't necessarily mean complex. So I often provide a very simple, short paragraph relative to use of open source in a vendor agreement. But in general, I think those in general have been somewhat silent in the past.
Yeah, and we're definitely seeing an uptick and expect to see even more in open source disclosures becoming more of a topic of interest earlier in sales cycles, right? We used to see this here and there when we sign final contracts for software sales, but we're now seeing it as part of discovery, as part of RFPs, certainly as part of due diligence and M&A transactions, where number one, kind of the first question is, are you able to provide a disclosure? And then number two, go ahead and do it, and let's see what's in there. So that's where, again, having OpenChain is one example of having a framework behind you that you can rely on, rather than kind of defining a process on your own. It is very helpful because it does walk you through how to get this done, how to set up a team, and how to make sure that you can continue to do this as your code base changes. Now, the third thing that we definitely think will happen as an impact will be that investments in things like open source program office, open source review boards, just having people with open source experience in your organization will increase. And we definitely see this as a challenge because the talent in this space is fairly scarce, but kind of the demand for it is increasing. So we do expect this to become a bigger part of academia, something that will be taught as part of computer science programs, any sort of program management, project management programs. And this is something where organizations are going to have to decide, are they going to make this a burden on development teams, or are they going to bring in specialized talent to be able to keep developers coding and to make specialists responsible for these types of tasks and work more as a team?
Yeah, and I think between standards and regulations and SBOM, organizations have been taking note and getting prepared. So what I've noticed, especially as we help companies to build out their open source program offices, is the number of people that are applying for jobs in the open source space seems to be declining. So we end up getting the roles filled eventually. We're just noticing that it takes a bit longer than it used to. Another observation, the title, Director of Open Source or higher, isn't as uncommon as it used to be just a few years ago.
Yep, absolutely. And in fact, out of curiosity, I just put in OSPO in LinkedIn last night. So we're now getting into thousands of hits for people having OSPO directly in their title, which was definitely not the case last year. Okay, and finally, our fifth point is the developer, right? And this one is tough because there's a lot of variability here, organization to organization. So each organization is going to really have to figure out what do they expect from their product teams, for their development teams. Depending on what it is that you expect from your developers, you have to set them up for success. So if you choose to make your developer kind of the master of everything, and on top of kind of technical expertise, you also expect them to be an open source expert and a licensing expert and a security expert, then you have to provide adequate training for them to be able to do that. You have to be supportive. You have to expect that their time coding is going to go down, their output will go down, and you will, as a result, be able to push less functionality out to your customers. So it's definitely kind of a conscious decision on where do you want to shift the burden for the developer. Now, you do have to also understand your developer is typically the last person to touch code, right? So the more you can train them to avoid mistakes, kind of innocent mistakes in the first place, and try to minimize the amount of remediation you will have later, that's going to be much more disruptive, the better off you're going to be. Right? So it's really critical to understand, again, kind of where do you see the developer role? What do you want them doing for your organization? And is that really the best use of their skill set to kind of be the master of everything related to products?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of ways, well, probably more than a couple, but two main ways you could have that model set up with the developers. So if you have like a centralized model for open source, that would require you to invest in dedicated experts. So that works well in larger organizations, and that keeps developers working and out of the heavy processes where they need to learn like in depth on tooling and manually filling out Excel sheets. I think developers today are tasked with too many things in general, in addition to just developing software. But this is one method of reducing some of that burden. Feel free, if anyone's curious, if you want to learn more about this method, just reach out. I'm happy to have a chat about it. The other method is decentralized. As Alex mentioned, that's you can expect velocity slowdown. Training budgets could increase, but you can't throw developers into the deep end and then expect them to take this on in addition to all the other non-developer things they're now responsible for. At least not without arming them with everything they need to be successful using a decentralized model for managing open source. So that said, like, you might not have the volume or the size to staff a centralized program, so decentralized or having the developer do their own scans, that might make more sense. And then there's always a hybrid approach to this as well, and that works really well for some organizations.
Yep. Okay, so let's summarize the 5 points again that we talked about, right? So our first 2022 prediction is that organizations will certainly use the events of 2021 as kind of the driving force to put more investments into getting their house in order, right? Whether that means learning kind of from procedural mistakes of the past, taking opportunities to improve how they react to any sort of security vulnerabilities, investment in tooling, investment in process, investment in training, but getting to a point where this becomes more of just an ingrained cultural element than a response to an event in the field. Second prediction is people will put more emphasis into getting ahead of shift to cloud mandates. Now, a lot of them are underway, so you may be coming in kind of in the middle of the process, but really thinking through what does it mean from a risk perspective moving to cloud? How does that change the composition of how your team works, how you source components, where they come from, and how do you deal with the volume of open source that's typically seen in cloud applications? Third one is just more emphasis on putting safeguards in place, right? So again, don't be reactive, don't wait for something to happen, but how do you protect yourself and protect the integrity of your work by not having to pull people off of their daily work to respond to an external event? We definitely see open source use driving greater business impact, and we talked about the elements that we think are going to happen there. And then really being conscious about, well, what is it that you want your developers to do? Hiring developers certainly is not easy these days. The market's very hot, depending on what region you're working in. There's definitely scarce resources. There's lots of competition for development resources. Some people may want to have a more extended role beyond kind of technical work. Others may not. So you also have to really understand your team, what their motivations are, where they want their careers to go, and make sure that you're aligned with kind of their needs as well as your organization's needs. Okay, and with that, we are happy to take any questions. I think we had one that I saw in there come in along the way.
We did. So Chris asks, how did you find all the licensing in containers? Were you able to locate the source code for everything, including the dependencies?
Russ, you want me to take it, or you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll just say that you'll probably have to tag in after this.
Sure.
For us, we've helped with when we've had to help with a particular company that's working on this specifically. We've found it's easier at this point, anyways, just to scan the source code that goes into the container. But I get the feeling you're talking about something you receive as a Docker image, which is where Alex would probably be better suited to answer.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, number one, what Russ said. Number two, so we're definitely seeing people using lots of tools now, right? Lots of discovery tools, and each one kind of has its pros and cons, right? So each one is better aligned to various use cases. So we definitely see people using tools out there designed to scan containers, kind of best of breed container scanners. We see people using tools for forensic level source code discovery, right? We're seeing people using tools for dependency scanning, right? So definitely seeing an uptick in just the number of tools being used, right? So obviously that presents a challenge and an opportunity as far as how do you organize all the results, how do you reconcile them, how do you kind of present a unified view. We also definitely see a lot more conversations between organizations and their suppliers if they're unable to scan, say you get an ISO image or you get a Docker image, and you're not able to get as much information out of it as you want, going back and requesting them to provide you disclosures on what went in. So kind of more collaboration throughout the supply chain and making sure that you're partnering with the kind of the same level of quality between organizations and same level of depth.
And so our next question reads, without an SCA tool in place, what can development teams do now to better manage the software supply chain?
All right, I'll take that one. So you heard me talking about inventory quite a bit and how important that is. And yes, an SCA tool makes that work so much easier. That said, don't let perfect be the enemy of good. Every organization has its constraints, whether that's people, funding, tooling, support, or whatever. It's absolutely fine to start with an Excel list of the open source you know you're using, if that's what you could put together. Other elements of an open source program that don't necessarily require SCA tooling is like policy and process development and developer training, just to name a few. So definitely don't neglect all these equally important areas.
Yeah, and I jump in with one other point is make sure that you spend time understanding what your risks are. Right? Not every organization is the same. Not every risk is relevant to your organization or your product specifically. So if you have limited capability, limited time, limited budget, limited people, make sure you're focusing on the top 1, 2, 3 things that expose you the most.
So can you comment on what the analysis boundary is for SCA?
Yeah, interesting question. We did talk about it a little bit, but certainly context matters, right? So if you go back to kind of what was the focus area of SCA 5-10 years ago? Well, it was the third-party content in a particular application. So lots of times customers would kind of carve out the third-party directory, and that's what we were asked to look at. Over time, that distinction kind of went away, and we moved into, well, now we're focused on the entire application, right? We not only want to look at third-party directory, want to look at your proprietary code, make sure that any sort of copy paste things and any sort of IP beyond software code was examined. I think as you start moving into cloud, as you start looking at containerized deployments, there's again kind of a bigger envelope. Right now you're looking at, well, what environment am I running in? What's the operating system? What are applications running next to mine? What does the server look like? Is the entire thing at risk? So you really need to understand the context in which you're deployed, right? You could be the safest application out there, but if the operating system you're running in is not safe, then it doesn't matter, right? You're still going to have an exploitation vector. So understanding the kind of the context you operate in, understanding your weaknesses, understanding where you're exploitable, what are the top threats, will help you define what is in scope for any sort of analysis from a composition perspective.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So this next question is about so companies that have different open source policies for each department. What would you have to say for companies that follow that practice?
So that's not that uncommon, actually. So the answer to that might depend on how well the individual policies line up with the corporate objectives. So I'm personally in favor of a single, well-defined minimalist policy. I think all too often companies get wrapped up in piling in all of their concerns and constraints into a policy, and soon enough you end up with a straitjacket full of policy that basically means nobody can do anything. So it's important to balance the business, enable your developers and balance that with the right amount of risk management.
And so it looks like I'm only seeing one more question, so I'll take this opportunity to remind our audience to send in any questions you might have. This would be your last call for questions. So this last question that we have right now asks, what's next for Log4j? I know we touched on it a little bit, but what's coming down the pipeline?
Okay, yeah, I could take this one. So, so a lot of things, right? And it's not just specific to Log4j. So for Log4j, I'd say specifically, keep watching the Apache bullets on the Log4j site, and Log4j's patches have had a long tail, right? Everybody is kind of chasing what's the latest release. So make sure you kind of keep up with that. I'm sure there will be new and better fixes made over time, new issues discovered. So I would expect to see maintenance releases and at some point another major release. But I think let's talk, I guess, a little bit about, well, what's next from kind of the Log4j process perspective. So again, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but this was a good wake-up call to not forget about kind of the other components in the past, right? The struts, the open SSLs, the other major security events, right? Log4j will go away in the future as far as being top of mind issue. That doesn't mean that there will not be new exploits in other components, or maybe new exploits in past components that have been exploited. So again, look at your process, make sure that you learn from last time around, make sure that you have safeguards in place, make sure that you are not forgetting to kind of review your the components that you've cataloged, and make sure that other vulnerabilities are being discovered, they're being addressed, that you have remediation plans in place. Make sure you have a point person assigned if there's an incident report that comes from the outside, right? Make sure you know kind of how you're going to run the play, what's going to happen when the next incident occurs. And make sure that you put more emphasis into architecture, into design, not just scanning an application once it's built, but thinking through security weak spots when you're starting development, right? Don't wait till the middle or to the end to think about security. Don't bolt it on at the end. Do it, put more time into the kind of the design phase, into the beginning, to make sure that you have security from day one.
Awesome. And so we actually have received one more question. So it asks, have you already seen that companies are getting better at reacting to zero-day events?
I could talk broadly about it, and then Alex, you can jump in
Sure.
as well. So, I mean, just from the inventory perspective, I think companies are getting better with managing their use of open source. So having that granular level of information regarding use of open source software in the products or your applications allows security teams to react better when new threats are detected. Reacting to zero day, I don't know, maybe Alex, do you want to chime in on that part?
Yeah, I mean, I think Log4j certainly changed the conversation here. It was kind of so ubiquitous, so far-reaching that every organization, even if they didn't do any work in Java, still had to look to be sure, right? And they had to look from two perspectives. They had to look from, are any of my products impacted? To, well, are any applications deployed in my network impacted, right? So it's kind of a twofer there. And I think coming out of that event, certainly I know we kind of revised and improved our incident response process. I'm sure lots of your customers called asking, are you impacted? If so, how? So you almost didn't have a choice but to figure out, well, did we know what to do when that call came in? And do we want to do something better next time around? So I would say for sure the opportunity was there for companies to improve. I know we have. I'm assuming lots of folks took that as an opportunity to revise and at least appoint a point person to kind of drive the process when the next thing comes in. So I would say yes.
Well, it looks like we have exhausted all of the questions that we're going to receive today. So I'll give you two the floor one more time in case you have anything you'd like to leave our audience with before we wrap up.
Well, certainly thank you for your time, for joining. Definitely welcome any sort of feedback. We put both our emails here, so please feel free to reach out to myself or Russ with any feedback, any questions, if you need further information about anything. There's also, I believe, some resources available through the chat dialog, so please feel free to download those along with the slides that are available to you, and we look forward to you joining future webinars with us.
Yep, just echo Alex. Thank you everyone for joining, and feel free to reach out anytime if there's any questions.
Well, Alex and Russ, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I'd like to remind our audience that the session was recorded, so if you may have missed the beginning or you had to leave early, you can rewatch this on demand on the DevOps website at devops.com/webinars. You should also be receiving an email with a link to rewatch this shortly after we conclude today. So we do have 4 $25 Amazon gift cards to give away. Our first winner is Darren B. Our second winner is Landry K. Our third winner is Jerry K. And our fourth and final winner is Oscar G. So congratulations to the 4 of you. Please keep an eye on your inbox to claim that gift card. And if you don't receive an email, just check your spam folder. So Alex and Russ, again, thank you so much. I'd like to thank Revenera and OSS Consultants for joining us and allowing their wonderful employees to join us today. And I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us for the entirety of today's presentation. Please take a moment to fill out our post-webinar survey, and we hope to see you all at an upcoming Techstrong Learning webinar. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.